Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, it is Wednesday and we're going to do another baseball one. Hope you guys enjoy this one. Oh, it's a little bit short, but you know. You ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is. Are you ready? I gotta run a race because I wasn't sure what else to put with baseball. There we go. Alright, and we got She Stole, we got Reef, there's Cal King, there's Anthony, there's Susan, there's Anubis, I keep digging, we go, Lainey, Luscious, Jacob, Swoop, Pete, Richmond, Jericho, Judy May, Frugal, I, JB, Tramps, there's Gloria, Pedroza, Tay, Cable, Miss T, Mylinda, Neil, excuse me. Oh, Miss T's in the lead. It's gonna be Miss T. It's Miss T. Alright, ready? We'll pull Miss T's. Okay. Now this is Miss T. It says, hello, wonderful people of the world. Thank you so much for visiting my channel. On this channel, all about positive vibes and motivation. And so here's her contact information. Ways to support her. And so we've got a lot of different things. We've got some meal prep, some how-tos, some shorts, like fun facts, and then her lives. A lot of it is just hanging out, play games. They want to hang out, chill, listen to people ramble or chat about different things. Check out Misty, like, share, comment. Have a good day. All right, baseball it is.
All right.
Bearded Historian 105.
For today's fun little tidbit in history, we're going to talk about the joy of lights. You know, for those of the true Puritans of baseball, they used to play matinee games in the middle of the afternoon. And, you know, for a lot of players, it was the way to go. You know, they would take and have you, wake up, take your kids to school, play a game, come home and have dinner at night. Well, the problem is that as, past World War II, a lot more people were looking at games in the evening time periods, and stadiums started turning to lights. Interestingly enough, the first stadium to have night games was in Cincinnati in 1935. Well, one club that they have a track record. For the longest time, were kind of known as the lovable losers. They would, have really great seasons. They get into the late part of the season, and then they just all of a sudden fall apart. Talk about the Chicago Cubs. Now, some people would blame curses. Some people would call bad luck. The Cubs, interestingly enough, would be the last team in Major League records to get lights. Now, originally, they were slated to get lights at Wrigley Field in 1942. However, something called Pearl Harbor happened, and that kind of went on the wayside. By 1945, when the Cubs reached the World Series, they were a minority of unilluminated teams, and in fact, by 1948, they were the last holdouts. Now, clinging to that simpler past, the club just simply refused to add lights to what would allow them to play at night. Some would consider this charming by purists. It was both delightfully out of step with the times and a step behind. Day baseball inspired possibly the greatest managerial rant of all time. Lee Elia in 1983's lament was that 85% of the blinking world's working and the other 15% come out here. How bitter was he? Now, the clock and the heat took their toll on North Side teams, and most notably in 1969, the club collapsed that September. A former Cubs pitcher, Rick Sutcliffe, says of playing day games at Wrigley, you get up in the morning, take your kid to school, play a game, come home, and have dinner with your family. He said, but I would throw a complete game at night at Dodger Stadium, I might lose anywhere from 2 to maybe 4 or 5 pounds. When I'd pitch a typical complete game at Wrigley, I would lose anywhere from 8 to 14 pounds in a 9-inning game. Literally, I had to get IVs because of all the weight I'd lose. Well, it wasn't until 1981 the team wound up getting sold from the Wrigley family to the Tribune Company, and that's when the attitude towards the team and the lights began to change. Now, merely selling Wrigley Field's experience wasn't enough. The Tribune wanted to win games and build revenue. Well, the first acquisition that they did was hiring general manager Dallas Green away from the Phillies, where he was the field manager for the Philadelphia's 1980 run to the World Series title. And Green, he was one of those guys. He would walk into a room, everybody's head turned. He had just this kind of aura to him. You know, walk in the room, everybody, he had this shock of white hair. He was a gunslinger. Well, Green, the lovable loser shtick, was no longer being tolerated, and neither was the lack of lights. When he got to town, he was soon campaigning for him. Well, he was working what he thought was right, and initially his passion for building the franchise and making it competitive rankled a lot of people, especially the residents at Wrigleyville. Well, here's where it gets really kind of funny, because you have the Cubs, the baseball team, versus the Cubs, or as in Citizens United for Baseball in Sunshine.
Okay.
Representatives of the Wrigley Field neighborhood banded together to fight the Tribune Company at every turn in its plans to install lights at Wrigley. They were already irked about the parking problems, traffic, and noise caused by 81 day games. They worried that rowdy and inebriated fans would cause even more havoc at night. Well, they can play night ball, Cubs member Charlotte Newfield told an Illinois House committee in 1982, but not in our neighborhood. Well, Green's cantankerous and coarse tone only emboldened the Cubs, who would come to games wearing T-shirts that said "No lights in Wrigley Field" and stage rallies outside the ballpark. Almost sounds like what the Raider fans were doing. They were organized outside the park, and they were organized enough to get both the Illinois legislature and the Chicago City Council to effectively ban night games. And perhaps that's how things would have remained for many more years, if not for an interesting wrinkle. The Cubs suddenly became good. Now, early 1980s, you started seeing guys like Ryne Sandberg start becoming really good. Green went out and was able to get trades for Dennis Eckersley, Scott Sanderson, and Sutcliffe. Well, in 1984, the team would win 96 games and the NL East pennant, which then became a viable threat to reach the World Series. Now, this would have been made for a great story in baseball, if not for one big problem. The previous year, the league had signed a $1.2 billion television pact with ABC and NBC that called for primetime World Series games. The day baseball at Wrigley threatened to tarnish that golden goose. Now, again, this was back in the days when home field advantage in the World Series alternated each year between the American League and the National League. And in 1984, it was the National League's turn, which meant if the Cubs got past the Padres in the championship series, there was a distinct competitive advantage in the Fall Classic. Well, Because of the lights issue, Commissioner Bowie Kuhn came up with an idea, a compromise. If the Cubs would reach the World Series, they could have their home games. But those games would be on the third, fourth, and if necessary, fifth, wrapped around a weekend. This would allow Major League Baseball to preserve the primetime weeknight TV slots for the other games. It shows you the power that TV was starting to have inside the game, Coletti says. I'm old enough to remember that all the World Series games were in the daytime. Suddenly, they're going to have to change a venue because of the influence and the partnership of television. Well, as it turns out, all this worry was actually moot. The Cubs would lose the NLCS to the Padres in 5 games. That home field factor also turned out to be moot, too. The Padres had the advantage in the World Series, but lost in 5 games to the Tigers. Yet, by actually fielding a competitive club, the Cubs had pushed the lights issue to the forefront. That meant a more serious discussion was looming the following year. Well, the letter, as it was known, begins with a brief baseball banter bemoaning the injuries and poor execution that contributed to a summer swoon in the standings. Then Green would get down to business. The Chicago Cubs will not be able to play in the World Series home games in Chicago this year because of the light situation at Wrigley Field, he writes. It is also possible that our league championship games will also be moved. The letter to the Cubs season ticket holders, dated July 19, 1985, would go on to explain the financial limitations of Wrigley, the national television contract that allowed the networks to insist on night World Series games, and the warning the Cubs had received from the new commissioner, Peter Ueberroth, that Major League Baseball was prepared to take drastic action in 1985, and moving the Cubs' home games away from their home park that had been avoided in 84. Now, how much of this letter was an exaggerated attempt to curry favor for lights from the fan base? Well, at the time it was written, the Cubs were not doing too well. They were 10-23, dropping them from first to fourth in the NL East. So it didn't appear anything realistic the Cubbies would be playing October games at Wrigley either way. But then again, at midseason, they were only 7.5 games out of first, which they'd erased that before. And with the Cubs in the midst of a court battle over the ban on night games that had reached the Illinois Supreme Court, and with Major League Baseball and the networks pushing hard for the light situation to get settled, a greater sense of urgency was in the air. Now, the Cubs had conversations with Major League Baseball about at least 2 possible postseason home sites. Milwaukee County Stadium and St. Louis's Busch Stadium. Now, the former had appeals that was close enough for a relatively easy commute for the Cubs fans, but the Brewers were still an American League club at the time of the days before interleague play, so most of the Cubs players were unfamiliar with that ballpark's clubhouses, dimensions, and quirks. For that reason, St. Louis had an appeal for the Cubs players that were well acquainted with the home of their National League East rivals. The one place I know we were never going to play would be over at Comiskey Park, where the White Sox would play. I think the Cubs fans would have killed us. I can understand why.
What why?
They no lost blood. It'd be like telling the Raider fans to go play at Denver. Nope. Of course, Cubs fans would have been very happy with Milwaukee or St. Louis either. It's one thing to have the Toronto Blue Jays playing home games in Buffalo in 2020 because the Canadian government did not deem it safe for them to play in Toronto during the COVID panic. As for Major League Baseball, to put the Division Series, League Championship Series, or World Series at a neutral site to reduce the risk of an outbreak. Well, it's quite another to envision Sandberg playing the World Series home games on an Ozzie Smith field merely because of a TV schedule. So, how serious did these conversations get? Well, the former Cubs president, Del Grinsko, told ESPN in 2017 that the club had signed a contract to play postseason games at Busch. This claim could not be corroborated, and Grinsko did not respond to messages seeking a follow-up interview. I think it was more of a threat orient than anything, because the team had such a difficult time with the neighbors and aldermen. Well, this difficulty would continue for 2 more years. The Cubs lost their Illinois Supreme Court case in October of 1985, which meant they were still barred from staging night games at Wrigley. And when the threat of an all-world World Series ultimately didn't move the needle, the Cubs went to the next level. They threatened to move to the suburbs. Night games at Wrigley posed challenges for local residents, but those challenges were nothing compared to the threat of not having any games. And then an accompanying economic boost at all. The WGN documentary, The Ivy Walls May Fall, aired in October of 1985 when the Cubs might have otherwise been donning their home whites at Busch, and helped sway the public support away from the Cubs and to the Cubs. Well, in 1987, Green would leave the Cubs behind. The icy relationship between the residents of the team began to thaw. Ultimately, the city council voted in February 1988 to allow 8 night games at Wrigley that season and 18 in future seasons. The unique 2020 season became the first in which the Cubs got the okay to have the weekend night games at Wrigley. Now, by the time the Cubs returned to the NLCS in 1987, they were no longer in danger of having to play the World Series home games away from home. Unfortunately, it was still many years before they would play any World Series games at all. Well, the wait, though, proved worth it in 2016. Celebrating a historic final out in Cleveland, not Chicago, wasn't optimal, but it was a hell of a lot more better than the thought of it celebrating it in St. Louis.
What?
But when they talked about when they used to play day games, I remember reading one piece that was kind of interesting because a father and son had gone out to catch a Yankees game. And it was so funny because it was the one game that they happened to get tickets for. And that was the one season that Larson threw the perfect game. And it just surprised the heck out of everybody. And then there's been cases where, when you get into those October days, the playoffs, you'll see things pop up in the paper, can you please excuse my son, we're going to go catch the baseball game. You'll see newspapers posting those neat little pre-printed notes for the school, My son is not going to be in today. We're going to be over here at Busch Stadium catching the Cardinals games. But, it was part of those purest days when they would have those afternoon contests or, you could listen to them on the radio, stuff like that. Now, TV has made it a lot different because, they broadcast all over the world. The time I always thought was kind of interesting is when they would broadcast the games all the way over into, like Iraq or Tokyo or, wherever our military forces were stationed. They loved to get those highlights, even if they were up at 2 o'clock in the morning. It just shows kind of the pivotal thing that baseball is. People still love the game. Now, I imagine that with the whole shift over and the fact that they're trying to do games faster, I imagine that's probably got more than a few people rankled up, and I've read some of the comments that people have said about how baseball is getting ruined by this whole idea. In its own way, I do believe they almost need to go back to purist baseball. But, like everything else, things evolve, things change. The question is, can they change back? I remember the one biggest thing that everybody said was going to haunt baseball for years was the birth of the designated hitter rule. And that happened the year I was born. That was 1973. And all of a sudden, they didn't need a pitcher batting in the American League. They had another guy, and that's all his job was to come up and bat for the pitcher. Now, they had to work around it when it came to the World Series, because when you played at the National League field, your pitcher batted. And, some people are like, oh, it's, some of your pitchers actually were pretty good hitters. It's the funny part about it. But I think a lot of it comes down to baseball. I do think, though, that I can understand the whole revenue want, because, people will tune into those games. And, of course, baseball, it's 162 games in one season. It's a chance to see a game that, sadly, I have never been to a Major League Baseball game. The closest we ever got one time was a minor league contest down in Denver But at that time, the minor league club, I think, was in Milwaukee, if I remember right, playing a road game. But we were outside of, at that time, it was what would later go on to become Coors Field, Mile High Stadium. But this has been the wanderings and rantings of a bearded historian. And you folks have a good weekend, and we will see you next week. Have a good one.
Wow. Yeah.